Research Unit for hosting tonight's event. To introduce Brewster, we actually have Trevor here, and Trevor's going to introduce tonight's speaker, so if you wouldn't mind coming up and doing that. And again, thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. It's my privilege to have a chance to tell you a little bit about Brewster before we get started. I first met Brewster when I was doing some research on a book. And I was up in Humboldt area. I was supposed to meet a fellow named Dwayne Ganaw, who works in a kind of alternative farm area. He's got a land trust thing called Genesis Land Trust and an organization called Earth Care. I was excited about what he was doing, and I was going to spend the day traveling around with him just to see what he was up to. And he showed up to pick me up and said, "I hope you don't mind, but there's a fellow going to join us today named Brewster Kneen." Well, I was very happy because if I had known Brewster was in the province, I would have set up something to meet him too. So I had this great opportunity to spend time in the same truck and spend a day with these two guys who've just done so much work on agriculture, food systems, and all those big questions that take such courage to approach. So I had a wonderful day in really getting to know Brewster a little bit, and was very impressed by him. I remember thinking how well he suits his name somehow. I don't know why, but you know how names are intangible things. He's got a great name, Brewster Kneen, and he seems to fit his name so beautifully. He's a wonderful spirit. You'll see it as he speaks. This is an area that can be very hard on a soul because you're facing huge issues, big powers in our world, and it takes great courage to face them. And Brewster does it with grace. And I remember thinking that just in that couple hours we spent together, that this is a man who is going to make it and going to be able to continue doing this because he's somehow remains hopeful and optimistic in the face of these great powers. And we were talking that day about some people who we both knew and had heard of. I had heard of them anyway, and whose lives had in some ways been deeply affected and almost harmed by this question and these questions that he addresses. But anyway, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about his life, because he's had a very full life so far. He was born in Ohio. He told me yesterday he spent his first 28 years there. He studied economics and theology there in the U.S. and then in the U.K. I think he met Kathleen at a conference, his wife Kathleen, when he was still in the States. They together went to the UK and did some studying there. Moved to Toronto in 1965. And there he produced public affairs programs for CBC Radio, worked as a consultant to the churches on issues of social and economic justice. But he wasn't going to be content. He wasn't the kind of guy who would just be content with, policy and theory from an arm's length, or just in that sort of academic distance. He wanted to get his hands dirty and actually see what it was like to be a person growing food. And this is the back to the land kind of time in our history. And so they decided that they would take their two children and move to Nova Scotia, which they did. They began farming there. They started with a cow-calf operation, which then developed into a very large commercial sheep farm. And he worked with the local people. He was telling us a bit about this last night at a dinner we had at our place, and some of the cooperative efforts that he organized with the local farmers, sheep producers there in Nova Scotia. And you might say, I think you're going to say a little more about that tonight. It sounds like it was a great time, and some of the things he started then are still going. So they were on that farm there for 15 years, and then in the 1980s he became involved with farm cooperatives. And he and Kathleen began to produce the newsletter that a lot of us originally have always identified Brewster with. Great name for the newsletter, The Ram's Horn, which is still going, which is another testimony to his stick-to-itiveness, I think. In 1986, the Kneens returned to Toronto, and Brewster began a career of writing and lecturing on the food system with increasing attention to biotechnology. In 1994-1995, he was Senior Fellow of the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. He was a founding member of the Toronto Food Policy Council. During this time, he wrote his first 4 books. The Kneens moved to British Columbia in 1995. They were first in Mission in the Fraser Valley, and then at a place called Left Fields in Sorrento in the Shuswap region. During this period, Brewster wrote one of his most famous books, Farmageddon, another great name, and Invisible Giant, the second edition of. And he became engaged in public education and organizing, helped form the British Columbia Biotechnology Circle. So biotechnology was really coming online, and the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, CBAN. Now, they spent from then, 1995 to 2006, and at that point, Brewster and Kathleen moved east to be a place that they felt was more hospitable to the way their lives were going at that time, Ottawa, which is where they are now. And he says that a bicycle now is able to replace the automobile much of the time, and he's happy about that. Their farm in Sorrento, though, now is operated by his daughter, Rebecca, and her partner, Brian McIsaac, where they run Crannog Ales, Canada's only certified organic farmhouse microbrewery. It's a place that we should all visit, I think. It sounds like a great place. And with a father named Brewster, what else was a daughter to do? Anyway, much of Brewster's current focus is on the cultural and ideological underpinnings of public and political life. His latest book, The Tyranny of Rights, was published last year. He's got copies of it here, and a little box of them just right back there. I think we should all go and buy one afterwards. I know I will. So you meet someone like Brewster, and you find yourself thinking, you know, we need more Brewster Kneens, more people who can speak the truth in the face of so much untruth. People who work tirelessly to transform a world in the grasp of insurmountable powers. People who live from a hope that has nothing to do with what is immediately achievable or winnable, and everything to do with what is just and good and right. Well, of course, people like Brewster Kneen don't come by very often. They're very, very rare. But the good news is this. Just by being in his presence, by hearing him speak, reading the words of his books, the rest of us are moved in our own small ways toward the same truth, transformation, and hope. Please help me welcome Brewster to the podium.
Thank you, Trevor. Maybe I should go home right now after that. I was, well, what can I say? Now I better perform. And this is, you folks in the back don't want to move down? You really don't? If you feel like it, feel free, because you're sort of scattered. Anyway, I will try and, I feel better with a more intimate setting, but anyway, I will proceed. When I was asked to speak, and I've forgotten what it was I was asked to speak about, it prompted me to come up with a title that I did put on this about agriculture, corporate governance, and the production of inequity, which simply reflects what I'm currently thinking about and applying some of that to the issues of using the food system and agriculture as sort of a case study in this for what I think is happening much more broadly. And I think if one was in almost any area today, we really should start with climate change and energy. But that's kind of a lot for one evening, so I think we'll have to set that one aside and say, okay, that's the large context, the issue of climate chaos or climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it. And the reality that people face, particularly, for example, South Pacific Islanders who see their homeland just literally disappearing under the waves, and the incredible. Well, people say, you know, what's it like? What are winters like in Ottawa? And everyone says, who knows? And I'm sure that's true here. You know, we'll see. So I just want to log that in that. And certainly on both questions, we face a formidable task of somehow getting the government of Canada to acknowledge reality and somehow depart from its oil sands mentality. It's going to be a big job. And hopefully we'll live long enough to carry it out. What I want to do here is use agriculture and be quite specific and sort of factual, but at the same time also to trace out, shall I say, the alternative by which actually the majority of the world's people live and feed themselves. And I've sort of, not in the title I mentioned inequity as an issue. The other one that I want to put up, raise up kind of as a flag, is the question of individualism. Because I think the individualism of Western society, Western culture, is a very dangerous, very insidious phenomena that we haven't begun to grapple with. We just sort of assume that we're normal in our individualism. And it's quite interesting. I was talking with a couple of our neighbors, and they are working because of where we are, they're working in IT, in information technology, very highly paid, I would say probably vastly overpaid, and talking with them, they were sort of saying, well, what are you thinking about now? And I mentioned individualism is one of them. And they said, well, what do you mean? And they really had a hard time, because they saw that, as so many people do, that if the minute you question individualism, you're questioning their personality. I'm an individual. And they don't, and I think, okay, that's sort of the self-understanding. I'm going to come back to that. But I think that if one looks at the ideology and the practice of capitalism, individualism is a major driver and an essential part of that economic philosophy. I don't like doing this, but I'm going to stick with what I wrote out. Some of it's written out and some of it isn't. Of course, agriculture is reputed to have a history of about 10,000 years, 9,000, 10,000. There seems to be some consensus around that. But of course, human beings have been feeding themselves for a great deal longer than that. I mean, you can say, well, okay, when did we start being a human being? Well, you can go back, And the problem was, how did these creatures that were our forebears feed themselves, if you want to put it that way? And we look at it within that 10,000 years. However, there are a whole lot of people, not only alive today, but of course historically, that have had nothing to do with what we refer to as agriculture. They don't drive 600 horsepower tractors. I can't believe what I read in the Western Producer these days about the size of machines. I mean, I just can't comprehend it. They don't drive 600 horsepower tractors. They don't buy seeds from Monsanto, or never did, and they don't sell their crop to cargo. On the other hand, they do tend gardens, hunt, fish, herd animals, gather wild foods, and in fact live essentially outside the industrial food system altogether. And often such people, wherever they're found, are referred to derogatorily as subsistence farmers, as if somehow that was really, a mean term. As if being able to feed oneself and one's family is a bad thing. After all, modern industrial farmers do not have to feed themselves or their family. They go to the supermarket and they buy their food, just like they buy the diesel fuel for their tractors and the agrotoxins for the crops that they grow from seed owned by Syngenta or Pioneer or Monsanto. Now, I'm in a sense, I'm caricaturing. It's not meaning to insult. I was one of the farmers who got a trial gallon of Roundup because I was one of the progressive farmers, and I understand how the system works. So I'm not trying to blame people, but simply describe this process that we're caught up in. I found some interesting figures from Etc. Group that peasants feed at least 70% of the world's population, which might surprise you. And they break that down into hunting and gathering is about 12.5%. Cultivated food produced by peasants, 50%. share of the world's food that comes from industrial food chain, 30%, and share of urban food produced by city-dwelling peasants, 7.5. Now, city-dwelling peasants, of course, are the tens of thousands of people living in the slums of Mexico City or Buenos Aires or any other large city that have had to migrate in the hopes, or in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, that were farmers and were forced off the land one way or the other and find themselves trying to survive in a city. Behind this brief sketch, which I will elaborate on, I want to sort of explore the attitudes that drive this and fuel it. The attitudes towards nature or Mother Earth, or as the Andean people say, Pachamama, toward history, toward science, and toward other people. Now, I was amused yesterday when I read the Toronto Globe and Mail on the Ottawa Citizen, which is, you have to hold your nose while doing it. Incredibly bad newspaper, but it's the only way I can find out what's going on in Ottawa in terms of politics and whatnot, even though I don't enjoy reading it. But the Globe and Mail had an interesting, on the front page, did anybody here see that yesterday? On the top left-hand corner on the front page of the Globe and Mail is what amounts to an editorial comment. And it said, "We are in a crisis of ignorance about our food supply." And it goes on and on, describing how we don't know where anything's come from, we don't know whether it's safe to eat or anything else. And this has to do with a concern about the adequacy of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And then they say food safety also needs to be taken overseas, as Loblaws, Walmart, and European retailers have done by pressing foreign suppliers to be certified to international standards. And we need clearer and more accurate labels to make informed choices as consumers. Now, what intrigued me was that, of course, they assumed the industrial system again, that that's all there is. So we have to know that Loblaws and Walmart are deciding and should decide what our policy is going to be. But then on the business section, there was a more interesting article, which quite surprised me. And I'm just citing this because it's the kind of thing I watch for. And if you're not tuned into it, you wouldn't ever notice it. You just pass over it because it's not, most of the stuff is not all that interesting. But he's discussing America. The title is America's Growing Class Divide of Sacrifice. Now, I think I would appreciate it if they would just see the U.S. growing class divide and stop referring to America as an empire that, you know, it's not just a nation, it's much more than that. There's probably, Americans are accustomed to framing their political battles around race, religion, region, gender, and so on. They get decided, they get squeamish, however, in talking about money. And she suggests that it's probably because the classless society, or at least one in which wealth depends on achievement rather than birth, is so central to the American idea. The problem is that you can't deny that globalization and the technology revolution are enriching the super elite and hammering everyone else. Now, that's in the Globe and Mail, the business press of record. CEO compensation, while U.S. unemployment is still hovering close to 10%, CEO compensation rose 3% in the last fiscal year. That continues a 30-year trend which has seen the top 1% of the rise from taking home 9% of the national income in 1976 to 24% today. Now, where's the switch? Or is that it? No, there it is. Okay, and I ran across this, and I'm sorry, I couldn't do any better because the original was very vague. But the point is, you're looking at the eve of the crash, 1927 to 32 in this area here, and then this trough of relative stability and where the differential between the top and the bottom was not so big. What this is the top 1% at the peak as a multiple of the average of the bottom 90%. So you have the top 1% as and the bottom 90% and their wealth. And that's what shows here. So we are now over right at the right-hand side at that peak again. And that's what, and when I talk about inequity, that's the best graphic I've seen of that. And it's interesting, it fits with a lot of statistics quite nicely. I've got some other figures which I don't think I'll just a couple of them. The wealthiest 1% of Americans now pocket nearly 1/4 of the country's income. 1%, taking 25% of the income. And they control as much as half of the total wealth, including property, bank accounts, investments, art, and the like. And their share of the pie has roughly doubled in the past 4 decades, which is what would be reflected here. Income is more evenly shared in Canada, but not by much. The trend toward greater concentration at the top is identical. And income inequality is growing faster in Canada than in all but one of the 17 leading developed countries. And that, again, was Globe and Mail statistics, which I find interesting. And I was trying to figure out just what goes in what order in this, because it's not that tidy. And that's part of the problem, that we think linearly in this society to a great extent. And as my wife and my kids point out, I have a habit of refusing to go straightly down the line, and all of a sudden I take a right-hand or left-hand turn. And they say, wait a minute, where'd you just go? Well, I was thinking, and this is what occurred to me. And it isn't all tidy and neat. So bear with me. The pieces are all here, and you may have wanted them in a different order, but this is what you're going to get. There's a wonderful book. How many people here know the book Spirit Level? Have heard of it? Good. That's a start. But it's a very interesting book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. It came out, I think, last year, and it's a new Penguin edition this year. And they make the case with exhaustive amount of research and analysis that the greater the inequity in a society, or the greater inequity, whether it's a state or a nation or between nations, the more social problems there. And they use the social indicators of health, a wide variety of them. For example, the level of trust that one finds, and they've done a lot of statistical work on this. Mental illness, life expectancy and infant mortality, obesity, children's educational performance, teenage birth, homicides, imprisonment rates, and social mobility. And they say in any one of those indicators, they all are correlated to the inequity. The greater the inequity, the greater the ill health of the society, if we can put it that way. And it doesn't matter whether the society is, where the bottom of the top is. It's the inequity that is significant. So that a society that has overall considerably poorer as a whole might in fact have much better health indicators across the board than a richer society. It all depends on the distribution. And why? Because an economy is supposed to be, it's about how we relate to each other and care for each other.
Can you repeat the title, please? Repeat the title?
Spirit Level. Easy to remember. And it should be widely available. It's quite fascinating and quite devastating. They've done an extremely thorough job of documenting this, and I've discovered that they have a long reputation for this kind of work. But what that does is suggest that that our answer to everything about economic growth is baloney. economic growth can produce as much ill health as good health. It's not the economic growth. In fact, I think it is probably the pursuit of economic growth is what's going to kill us all with energy and climate and so on. It'll be the death of us. And yet, if you live in Ottawa and listen to what's going on, that's the only thing that's going to save any of us is economic growth. You say, somebody or quite a few people are really out of their minds, or else their political fortunes are well attached to people who think differently than I think probably most of us here do. Anyway, I want to go back and sketch this to the agricultural side of things some more. Just one other clipping from a couple of days ago. Yesterday, I think it was. Again, there's a new report out that says that the calls on the Harper government to pursue an aggressive strategy to reduce poverty. But then what it goes on and what they're talking about is welfare to ameliorate the condition of the dispossessed. It doesn't say anything about taxing the rich in order to pay for it or anything of the sort. It's all we have to look after. We up here have to look after those down there. Now, one can be rather cynical and say, well, of course, because if it gets that's too extreme, they're going to get out of hand and revolt. We'll have a march on Ottawa. Well, I'd love to join, but anyway, that's the fear. Well, I want to go back and now I'm going to do the more very concrete on terms of agriculture in Canada and the rise of corporate agribusiness. When we started farming, and I must say, I have to elaborate a little on Trevor's introduction, because one of the reasons we farmed was I was doing work in economic development and economics, and around 1970 was when the insurance industry decided it was time to rebuild the heart of Toronto, Bloor Street, Bloor and Yonge, and all the fine old buildings that were there, and they weren't good enough for so they started tearing them down and rebuilding. Well, I sort of asked myself, well, wait a minute, where does the insurance industry get its money? They don't produce anything, so where do they get it? Well, maybe I should go and find out. So I knew about economic theory and so on, but what happens in fact? So we looked around and said, okay, Kathleen and I were both Easterners. Let's go to Nova Scotia. I'd been down on a couple of trips and work related. So we decided to move to Nova Scotia, and we ended up buying a farm in Pictou County, the home of our Minister of Defense, Peter MacKay. It was his father, Elmer, at that point, who was MP. We ended up buying a farm, and Pictou County was a good case study of third world underdevelopment. Had an aging Hawker Siddeley car plant that was making railroad cars, or had been. A Michelin tire plant, which was just being finished construction when we moved, which was the high end of the industry, at the cutting edge, that moved to Pictou County because it exploited a labor force that was scattered all over the county. And if you combine that with the rotating shifts, the workers would never organize. They'd never be able to go to work at the same time together. You'd keep them always off guard. Brilliant strategy. And a French priest who knew Michelin's home territory very well gave us a very good introduction to the policies and practices of Michelin tire. Still a good tires, but you just need to know what produced them. Anyway, we thought, okay, and a marginal fishery, quite typical. So we bought this farm, and I remember we didn't really intend to farm. I was just moving from the metropolis to the hinterland, if you know that stuff, to understand how the economy actually functioned. Like, where was the wealth coming from that was being sucked up into Toronto? We ended up buying a farm. We paid all of $18,000 in 1971 for 201 acres, 12 cows, their calves, and a bull that we should have eaten the next day. But anyway, after a year of learning with no background, we arrived in July. The hay had to be made, so we used what was left of the equipment, which was pretty miserable, and started putting the hay in the barn. It started raining, and we realized the roof was leaking, so we had to put a roof on the barn. And the neighbors said, well, these guys are serious. There were a lot of homesteaders around who weren't taken very seriously, but we got in with a community of old farmers at that point, because we were there to stay, or we wouldn't have put the roof on the barn. But a year later, I took the 12 calves, or however many we had at that point, to the feeder sale. And I remember, in spite of my academic and other training, being somewhat taken aback by the low return we got for our calves. I said, wait a minute, we've worked for a year, we've raised and fed those animals, looked after them, and so on, and that's all I've got? That's when we started on sheep at that point, and we sold the cattle. But that got me into the raw side of the economics. That's why I'm mentioning it. And it's partly just to say, well, it's not all just intellectual stuff. It's got some real background. And then, as Trevor referred to it, along the way, we realized that if we were going to survive, we would have to organize. It wasn't enough to take our lambs to the feeder sale in the fall again and hope the drovers would pay enough so we could survive for the next year. We said, okay, we knew there was a local market that wasn't being filled, and because some of us had developed feeder lamb freezer lamb sales to the doctors and lawyers in Halifax. So anyway, it seemed clear we had to organize. And fortunately, and I'm telling the story partly because it indicates how far we've moved in 30 years, 40 years, from what was considered more or less normal to something that would be almost impossible to do today. And that is that we got together, I started organizing the farmers. I was secretary of the Sheep Producers Association and importing electric fencing and various things. We knew all the producers quite well, and we started organizing into a marketing co-op. And it took literally 2 years to transform the sheep flocks and the farmers from producing randomly lambs that would and selling them off for whatever they could get in the fall to delivering lambs 52 weeks of the year to Sobeys stores in Metro Halifax and getting the best price in the country on a predictable basis. And I say it just because it was probably a somewhat unique time. The fact is, too, that in 1978 is known as really the peak year for at least small farms in Canada. It had been uphill to that point in 1978, but that was when, on a net basis, farmers were better off. So we were at a particularly opportune time to do this kind of thing. That would be probably a few years either way, we wouldn't have been able to do it. Because from 1978, it's been downhill ever since in terms of net income, basically. But the interesting thing was that, and again, this is for perspective, the reason we could deal with Sobeys, who is now, I think, second or third largest retailer in the country, was because old Frank Sobey at that point, the founder, wanted lamb in his stores. He'd grown up with fresh lamb, and he wanted lamb in his stores. Well, Canada Packers, and he couldn't deliver. Canada Packers lambs were killed in Toronto, trucked down to Nova Scotia, and whatever conditions. And if the butcher didn't sell them the day they arrived, they were garbage the next day practically because they'd so poorly cared for. And so we took it on, and Canada Packers, I remember them coming to visit and sort of trying to threaten me and saying I was being ridiculous and couldn't do it. A couple of times they did that. And we said, sorry folks, either we do it this way or we're not going to be in business. And so people were quite amused. I mean, our fellow sheep farmers would say they wouldn't understand my relationship to Ron Young, the Sobeys buyer, because I'd go and drink scotch and swim in his pool in his backyard. And I said, this is supposed to be an antagonistic relationship. We got to be competitive here. I said, no, Ron knows that we know what we're doing. We're providing something nobody else can provide. He needs it. So why don't we work together? that's an extraordinary kind of experience at this point in terms of the whole food system. And that's why I'm telling you the story. But that time was also when Eugene Whalen was ag minister, probably really the last real ag minister we've had. I was very fond of him. I mean, just great character, but so real and approachable. And I remember before we quit farming, which we did in 1986 because we, as I say, we lost our indentured labor. Our kids grew up and went to university. We couldn't run 400 ewes and market lambs year-round without at least that much help. So they grew up doing chores before school, after school, and all summer long and everything. And now one of them is proprietress of a very fine microbrewery, and the other is working with Mining Watch Canada, trying to keep an eye on the mining industry globally that Canada is responsible for. Anyway, but I remember those days in the late, in the 70s and early 80s, when there were meetings in Ottawa about agricultural policy. And really, we're right up front. I mean, I remember the ag ministers and deputy ministers and so on, and there was a genuine debate about policy. Now, that doesn't say we liked what came out of it, but there wasn't just a rubber stamp of some guy in a silo you could never get a hold of. It was anything but. And I remember one occasion when one of the Monsanto executives, I thought maybe I'd give him a heart attack. He turned bright red, and I thought he was going to explode because he wasn't used to being questioned by a farmer or an ex-farmer. I mean, it was just outrageous. I didn't know my place in the world. Well, I'm sorry, I did. But I thought, holy smokes, I don't want him to drop dead then and there. That wouldn't be nice at all. But that was the environment. Now, in 1997, and we're just sort of jumping at a couple of high points here, that was when the CFIA was carved out of Agriculture Canada as supposedly a very creative move to deal with many problems. But I remember calling up shortly after the CFIA was set up, and I said, well, that's interesting. I get the same guy and the same telephone number at the same desk. What's changed? Well, part of what didn't change was the handling of genetic engineering. Gene Hollybone was a head of the pesticide directorate in Ag Canada at that point, and and again, it was a different time. I could go and talk with Gene and walk in. I didn't have to get a security check and everything else. I just said, walk in and find her, and if she was there, if she was or wasn't. And she explained that they couldn't have separate regulations for genetic engineering, which I was arguing for, because I said, look, this is not just another pesticide. This is a whole lot more. And you can't just lump it in with pesticides and deal with it in a marginal sort of way. And her response was, and she was, I've admired her. I mean, she was just being very straight. Look, to set up new regulations would take too long and be too difficult. We'd never get there. And we can't, so anyway, the CFIA was, at that point, genetic engineering was just on this corner of her desk, as she pointed out to me. And she had all this other stuff that she had to deal with, and it was just this. So that was just moved over to the CFIA. And of course, from day one, it was beholden, and policy has been directed by Monsanto and their colleagues without question. And I could go into that, but hey, if you want reference, I think read Farmageddon. There's a lot of that stories in there. But the CFA was set up basically to serve the corporate interests of not just the biotech industry, but Maple Leaf Foods and McCain's and Cargill and so on. And at one point, Cargill's, one of their senior vice presidents from Winnipeg, was moved to Ottawa and occupied the office next to the Deputy Minister of Agriculture at that point to advise on policy. It was pretty blatant. But that's the way it was shaping up. So agriculture, and at the same time, agriculture research was being redirected or directed to the corporate sector. So you have, and gradually it's got to where it is now, where anybody doing research in agriculture has to have their corporate partner who really basically decides the agendas, what you will get what they will support and what the government will in turn support. Now I'll skip those statistics. You don't need those. And over this period of time, what we've seen as the rise of what I like to refer to as corporate oligopoly in the food system, where every sector in the food system is dominated by essentially 3 to 5 corporations. It's really quite amazing. And it keeps taking in more areas. Like it wasn't retail, but now if you look in Canada, it is indeed retail. You've got you've got Metro, Loblaws, and Sobeys. And there's constant mergers and reshuffling. And I just was looking at some of these in terms of the controlling agents. And again, this is from Etc. Group, which does some amazingly good research. In inputs, seeds, in terms of the controlling agents of seeds and genetic engineering, you have Monsanto, DuPont, which is pioneer when you see it up on the seeds, and Syngenta. And the gap between those and the rest, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 companies, is always very substantial. So they look basically at the top ones. In fertilizers, guess who? Potash Corporation. I think that's all kind of familiar topic around here. Second is Yarav, Norway, which you never hear of. Third is Mosaic, of which Cargill is the controlling interest. And number 5 for you locals is Agrium. And that's global. We're talking global here. In agrotoxins, as I like to call them, you have Bayer, Syngenta, BASF, Dow, Monsanto, and DuPont. It's a little more spread out there in terms of the top. And it's interesting, the machinery never appears. I'd love to know what John Deere's, how much more they have of that sector than anybody else. I remember buying a wonderful piece of John Deere equipment, their hydraulic manure spreader, when I was trying to figure out how I could grow all of our lambs with no inputs and get the manure on our scattered acreage. I finally ended up buying a very expensive John Deere manure spreader. But I knew I could sell it for just about the same price that I paid for it. So I did that and hauled that around the area with my Belarus 400 tractor, which was our workhorse. What would you call that? Donkey? Mule? I don't know. It wasn't as graceful as a horse. Anyway, but you have the same thing on the other side of the ledger, the outputs, as I say. You've got on the top food and beverage manufacturing, Nestle, Pepsi, Kraft, Coca-Cola, Unilever, Tyson Foods, Cargill, Mars, and Archer Daniels Midland. Those are the top players globally. These are all global figures. And then in food retailing, Walmart is by far the biggest. But I ran across the figures for what I would refer to as big meat. Tyson at the top of the heap. JBS from Brazil is second and very close to top and probably will surpass Tyson in the near future. And Cargill is number 3. And then you move down to ones that are half the size of Cargill and so on. So you just keep seeing this. And really, anywhere you look, you'll come up with the same kind of picture. I'll take that one off. You've got that one memorized now. You've got that one, so you don't forget it. I ran across a couple of graphics. A guy named Howard at Michigan State University has done some wonderful stuff. This is just the cross-licensing agreements. Because we talk about these separate companies, I just listed off. But then you look at what's going on between them. And these all have cross-licensing of their in genetic engineering, and whether it may be whether license to use a Monsanto gene construct in something that Pioneer or BASF or somebody's making, or whatever it is. It's this intimacy, shall we say, of the corporate giants in this area. Even more startling, however, is this one. And there's no way you can read it. You need a magnifying glass. But you can see, this is the seed industry. And really, if you're looking at agriculture, obviously, seeds are rather a crucial part of the whole system. So if you notice, there's the heart of it, quite literally. So what you see here is Syngenta, Monsanto, DuPont, Limagrain, can't read that one. What is that one? Bayer, KWS, and Land O'Lakes. But these are all, they're satellite seed companies. And of course, Monsanto is the one to observe. And how much do they control? Because in some crops, like maize, I think it's 80%, or maybe that's soy, globally. And that's kind of frightening. And I just think the image, that just gives you a picture of the relationships, which is quite important. Now the next step, which they've moved to now in all this, is referred to in one of the clippings I was reading from the Globe, was the setting of policy more directly by Big Food in terms of industry-controlled and created food quality and safety standards. So you'll find, on the one hand, one of the students this afternoon was asking about fair trade, which in a sense is a standard as well, but of a rather different sort. But Cargill is, and there's a group called the Roundtable for Responsible Soy, and there's also a one for palm oil. And these are roundtables where the major industry giants get together and decide on standards, partly to present a better picture to the public about their good practices, but also to clean up the renegades. Like Cargill has put the screws on one of their Malaysian oil palm contractors, their growers, because of their destruction of forest to make plantations for oil palm. Because Cargill knows that, well, that's going to be bad business if that gets out, so we'll take the position that that's got to stop. So you find the industry setting these standards all the way through. Walmart has come out with their own take on this. But what that means, obviously, is, in a sense, that's bypassing Codex Alimentarius and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in many ways, where the industry will take responsibility. And of course, it's all self-regulation, which I hope doesn't set well with you. It certainly shouldn't. Nowhere is that clearer than in the pharmaceuticals. Well, I got to be, oh gosh. Well, no, we're doing all right. I was thinking about this. Well, the other, an example of the kind of corporate buyouts, because now it continues. This whole area of mergers and acquisitions, which is a constant sort of game, where buying out one company, buying another, and you say, why are they doing it? Why was BHP? What was wrong with Potash Corp that BHP Billiton thought it would be a good thing for it to buy it? Who gains from that? The farmers aren't going to gain, that's for sure. So who's going to gain? Well, the shareholders of BHP Billiton. That's about it. And that has nothing to do with the farmers or their needs or anything like that. An interesting little example of acquisitions, just a couple of weeks ago, now is the entry of private investment firms and funds into the food system in different places. Maple Leaf Foods is selling its Ontario pork processing business, one of the largest in Canada, to the private equity firm Sun Capital Partners that is focused on leveraged buyouts, meaning that they're just looking around for some company to buy up cheap and then on using somebody else's money and leveraging that by never paying for it until they've handed it off to somebody else, and so it's just a constant chasing of money. But that's now coming in a big way into the food system. And the most notable of that now is the whole question of land grabs. And these sovereign wealth funds Saudi, various, and corporate funds and private investment firms. There's some going on in this province. Can't remember the name offhand. But private investment firms looking for investors in farmland. They're putting together a package deal, and they'll sell shares in this investment fund that is investing in agriculture and putting together packages. There's a couple of recent ones that one guy is one of them. Anyway, I can't get it. I can't get into all those details, but it's pretty frightening when you're talking about somebody in Madagascar or any number of African countries buying up, say, 60,000 or getting an option or some kind of a deal with the government for 60,000 acres. And what was there? They say, well, the land was underused. Oh, that means that the peasants were farming that in a subsistence style and making a living, supporting themselves and their community. But it's underused because it's not in monoculture soy or monoculture jatropha or monoculture something or other, farmed efficiently. Because that's all, we've told them that's how you have to farm. Well, okay, so much for the, I was thinking about skim milk. What do you think I was thinking about skim milk? I thought, oh, yeah, that's what the corporate sector is about, skimming the cream off of everything and leaving us with nothing but skim milk. So next time you buy 2% or skim, think about that. Say, where did the cream go? I kind of like the image. Okay, what I want to do, and I debated with myself, which order do things go in? But I'm aware that we've been talking for a little while. No, Trevor had a long introduction. That's you're responsible for that. What I would just caricature again, and it's a caricature, I realize, but it's, I want to draw the lines here in terms of talking about industrial commodity production. And the term commodity, of course, is important because that's what the product is referred to. It's a commodity. And I remember I used to get pissed off as hell when the Department of Agriculture would talk about our lambs as product. How much product did you do? That's not product. Those are lambs. Have some respect for them. It really got to me. But that's the way your mind has to work, commodity production. For the market, which means in this part of the country, mostly for export. And we're taught that farming is a business. We must think as businessmen. It's always men, You don't hear it the other way around. And when we were farming, and I was on the board of the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture and various things, and it used to get to me, the farmers would come to the meeting and they'd have their damn neckties on. And they'd talk about profit. And I finally started saying, look guys, you're not even making a living. What is this profit talk? Profit's after you've paid for everything. It's what you have left over. It doesn't come first. And it got to be a joke. And if I came in the room, can't use that word. I thought, well, good. Because that's part of the education. But in the same way, people are taught to think of, we're running a business. And we've got to be competitive, and so on. So you find this ideology behind our industrial agriculture model that is very strong. And I think one of the, it has to do with bookkeeping. We never had a farm business plan. We say, well, we paid all the bills. It's the end of the year. We got a little money in the bank. I guess it was a good year. We didn't go into debt. We did have a mortgage on one of the farms, thanks to the Farm Loan Board. Very reasonable. We paid for that. That was no problem. But that was very different than sort of having this double entry bookkeeping and accounting for everything and spending hours and hours trying to figure out how do you put a price on all that. And the assumption of industrial agriculture is you can price everything. And well, I don't know. What is a pregnant ewe worth? Is a lamb going to live? There are so many questions. Try and say you've got to commodify all of that and put it down in double entry book. That's not a good idea. It really isn't. But part of that, we learned a lot from our sheep. We learned to pay attention to them. When we had one spring, we had a serious problem of E. coli, and I finally realized that the problem wasn't going to be solved by drugs. It was our management that was the problem. We were asking them to put up with conditions which were not reasonable, and they were responding accordingly. And we learned a lot. We had a lot of lessons that way. Sometimes costly, but we learned. But with industrial agriculture, that isn't the approach. It's a question of forcing uniformity in every aspect. I mean, after all, if you're going to harvest a crop efficiently, you want it all at the same height on the same day with the same degree of ripeness, so you can harvest it with 16 combines, 16 feet wide, going down a field and a flight. And it started back with corn and the hybridization of corn, of course. It's saying, okay, if you're going to harvest corn with a harvester, you can't have the ears randomly placed and the corn different heights and maturing slightly different times. It's all got to be uniform. So we've ended up with a system that assumes that uniformity is a good thing, and it's got to be striven for, and to maximize that. To maximize that, we'll call on genetic engineering to push that a bit further. We won't just rely on traditional plant breeding. We'll now construct the plant according to our specifications. Now, one of the things about that, of course, is that any monoculture is a sitting duck for all kinds of problems. And this comes back to climate. And I really wonder what's going to happen to prairie agriculture when the climate shifts. It won't have to shift very much. When you won't get the crop won't be harvestable. What then? People learned that long ago, and peasants have always known that. You never plant one crop and count on that. You plant all kinds of things. Not just in different fields, you plant them together. Because you get symbiotic relationships of one. I mean, it's the bean and corns. Nitrogen using, nitrogen producing. So you put them together. You don't go and run off and buy a bag of nitrogen or a tank full. You grow it where you need it. But what I find most disturbing in this industrial agriculture model is that the underlying assumption that nature is inadequate, deficient, and must be improved upon. So in the seeds, you've always got the language, improved seeds. Now, that, again, is an insult. The seed isn't what you thought you wanted. What do you mean improved? What was wrong with the original? Well, it didn't meet my specifications. Well, precisely. So it's this question of control and domination and exploitation of nature that I think is very worrisome. And it's not going to survive because it can't cope with reality. It only can cope with it like the Green Revolution as long as the inputs and everything is in order and affordable. You may get away with it for a while, but that is going to carry on. And behind this, I've mentioned the individualism before, and I'll save that for just a minute, because I want to just shift the other side of the ledger, as it were, with peasant agriculture. When I was writing From Land to Mouth, I came up with a sort of slogan of feed the family and trade the leftovers. It's just the reverse of what commercial agriculture is supposed to be about. And I thought, well, yeah, that's what farmers have always done. You feed the family, and if there's something, whatever you have left, you trade for what you can't do, and what you can't grow this, but my neighbor can. They've got a slightly different ecosystem, so we'll trade, or we'll grow a little extra and trade it. And so that this form of agriculture, and again, we've got to change our language because it includes the garden, the farm garden, which very few exist in North America anymore. Of course, includes what we refer to as farming in a small scale, maybe, fishing, hunting, gathering and harvesting, herding, all these activities. And a lot of them may be carried on by the same community or even the same people at different times of the year. And those systems are highly complex and diverse, which is, of course, the key to survival. They know that. And you've got to have a diversity, because if you only have two crops and it's a bad year for both of them, one doesn't like the climate and the other one doesn't like the bugs, you're going to starve. And that's not a very good strategy. So it's always been complexity, and not just what's growing in the ground, but of, all kinds of things. So you have, fish in the rice paddies, snails, and then you eat the greens that grow on the buns around it, and so on. And what you have is a highly resilient, essentially autonomous system, local, scattered around. And the assumption is, and the aim is, to have harmonious relations with Mother Nature. Not to dominate and control, but to have harmonious relationships with Mother Nature. With all that would be implied in that, which, I think is beyond a lot of ours. What are you talking about? What do you mean harmonious relations with Mother Nature, with Pachamama? And I asked Aymar, a friend from Bolivia, I said, well, if the earth is Pachamama, what's the water? And he responded, no, actually one of his students responded, it's the blood of Mother Earth. Whew. That's pretty heavy stuff when you think that way, but that's the cosmology. And how do we deal with that? If we think, oh, come on, that's way out of it. You're backwards. I don't know what you are. But it's worth thinking about, because the assumption is in this is that Mother Nature is abundant and should be respected, learned from, with gratitude. And that's such a totally different attitude than our dominant system. No matter. Well, there's one behind us. I come back to the individual. Oh, before I do that, I can't resist. I'm sorry, this is not. Oh dear, it doesn't. I hope you can get the image. It's problematic because it was to reproduce, because it wasn't enough dots in it to start with. But this was a few years back. But I can't resist using it because it captures so much. Where you have, what this is monoculture corn. And if you could see the original, you could see that it's very uniform. And the ground is totally barren except for the corn. And here you've got this tank drawing a crop sprayer. Boy, does that ever capture the whole bloody system in one image? And this was, I think it was DuPont. Yeah, DuPont putting that out. An ad from one of the farm papers. I'm composed not only of my father, my grandfather, my mother, and so on, but then there was A.J. Musty. Oh yeah, and there was Josef Hromadka, and there was Reinhold Niebuhr. And they've all constitute who I am at this point by the interactions over the years. Well, isn't that interesting? I didn't emerge just, like a dandelion on the pavement. And then I say, well, okay, traveling through life, I'm quite aware at this point that someone says, oh yeah, I met you back here. And I heard you speak over here, or something of the sort. That happened last night with Marianne. And I say, oh yeah, I'm leaving bits of me behind as well. So I have this future self, as it were, that, it's not isolated. That's just the way it is. And then I look around and say, oh yeah, and tonight I look around and say, oh yeah, I'm not here by myself, because you folks are all here. And so that constitutes one of the laterals, a contemporaneous community, as it were. And constantly changing, enriching, becoming, some pieces lost, some gained. But that's really, in terms of, well, who am I? Well, I got to describe all those things. It's very complex. It's not simple at all. And if you're insecure, that's a good cure to realize that. Say, no, you're not alone. And one of the things I find now is, as I think of, sort of reminded somebody, a guy, Ray Epp, who worked here years back. I don't know if anybody remembers him. Mennonite Central Committee out of Winnipeg. We were involved in some of the land trust work in the mid-'80s. I heard from the other day from Japan. He married a Japanese woman and is growing blueberries, and now he's managing an organic farm and great big CSA in Hokkaido. I got this wonderful story. I said, okay, well that's part of that. So then we say, okay, well then what is a society? And that's what I think it looks like. All this, we construct this web. Yeah, I said I would mention the rights tonight. Because I just did a little plug with my latest book, Tyranny of Rights. One of the things I think is a major issue is individualism. Because the individualism that against this kind of picture is, I would say, is socially destructive. When an individual asserts themselves as an autonomous being, as a separate, they really, and starts claiming rights against any one of these, whether it's the state, your neighbors, or whatever, you start pulling apart the fabric of society. And it's socially destructive. So I think we need to think about that, because that's very much a part of our industrial agricultural ideology, and the images of, and some of it's very good imagery. I mean, and I had a great time farming and putting my all into it, and sort of feeling really good about that, and doing it all myself. I mean, doing everything. But then again, I wasn't alone either. Okay, I think I've said a lot about the along the way. Just one other thing. I can put this on an overhead, but it kind of captures the epitome. This again is from the business section of the Globe and Mail, and it's an advertisement for some investment. Well, I guess it's Scotiabank, but the slogan is "I trade," and down in this corner it says "I trade for me." And boy, that they would put that as an advertisement is quite revealing, I think, and quite disgusting as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, well, I think we just need to remind ourselves of the purpose of a corporation, because in some sense, all the corporations are doing is what they were designed to do, to make money. And they do it by a variety of means, whatever the field they're in. But it's kind of interesting to go back and think, no, wait a minute. Originally, corporations were chartered for some public purpose, whether it was the East India Company or Hudson's Bay. The charter required certain things that were, in this case, the Crown, whatever it was. It wasn't just a license to go out and exploit whatever. They were bound, and the charter could be revoked. And in the late, or 1765 or 69, the Blackstone wrote a commentary on British law at that point, and it's quite an interesting statement, which is still very valid. Persons are divided by the law into either natural persons or artificial. Natural persons are such as the God of nature formed us. Artificial are such as created and devised by human laws for purposes of society and government, which are called corporations or bodies politic, for the purposes of society and government, which is important, because now we have the reversal, where I'd say the corporations are not chartered by the government is chartered by the corporations. And if you look all the way through the system, and I think I won't go into that, except to say that, of course, the responsibility, as we understand it now, of the corporation is to maximize shareholder return by whatever means. Fair means are foul, and they're becoming fouler and fouler, as we've seen in the last couple of years. And with the sort of mergers, acquisitions, and leveraged buyouts and so on, we see that the means of making money become ever more abstract, layer upon layer. And when somebody pulls one of the pieces out, the whole thing will collapse. But we have to keep it up. And I'm suggesting that that game has just about run out. And we're going to have to start all over again. And we're going to have to turn to our subsistence societies, or the people who say, no, there's enough. There is enough for all of us. And no, I don't want to be competitive with you. I want to live with you together. We've got to form a society here. I don't want to spend my life feeling insecure because you're going to come and get me because I've been trying to poach on your land or whatever. Who wants to live there? And I think a lot of people who will sort of unconsciously express the dominant ideology, if you've got them alone somewhere on a long walk and a nice day, you might find that they'd really rather live somewhere else in a different headspace and a different heart. It's going to be a big task, because I think what we've got to say is the inequity which this society is producing out of constant pursuit of wealth is becoming more and more unpleasant and unjust. And we really shouldn't put up with it. And there are simple solutions. It isn't trying to help the poor live a little more decent life. That would be part of it. But really it's about increasing the equity across the society. And that's going to mean that instead of increasing the, of lightening the tax burden, as they put it, on the corporate sector, it will mean taxing the wealthy quite severely. But I, for the life of me, cannot understand the morality of a society that accepts one man with a huge multi-billion-dollar income and foundation and wealth is deciding global policy and healthcare. This is very strange. But Bill Gates, he's just another human being. Why have we given anybody, why have we created a system that allows that to happen? Or for Cargill, or for Monsanto, or anybody else. We've got to take it all back, and I think we're just going to start down on the ground. And it's very interesting, because that's what's happening today with the projects all over the place about CSAs and farmers markets. So it look like little drops in the... But I think people are beginning to say, wait a minute, this is a whole lot more fun. And there's plenty here. In fact, there's usually leftovers. Like, we had dinner last night, and Trevor says, yeah, it was really good tonight, too. There were a lot of leftovers, which invariably happens at a potluck. We have them every 2 weeks. And there's always food left over. And it's not magic. It's just the way we look after each other, in a sense. So I think I've said enough. So that was longer than I thought, but anyway, I didn't see anybody nodding off, so I guess. So I guess it's fair game for anybody who wants to. There's microphones if you feel you need it. I don't know whether microphones, I guess in this room it probably are. I don't know. But for my hearing, which is really poor, it's probably a good idea.
Hi.
Rebecca.
So I thank you very much for the talk. And I especially like hearing about, or thinking about oligopolies and the sort of vertical and horizontal integration and the sort of issues around corporate ownership of our political systems and so on. But what I always like to think about is solutions, like how do we approach these issues, right? How do we deal with some of these issues? And I always think of one part of the solution being looking at the sort of policy and legislative and regulatory approaches to dealing with some of these issues. And I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking about something that Wayne Roberts said to me years ago, and we were talking about food policy issues, or just food policy. And he was talking about the Toronto Food Policy Council. And he said, which you're familiar with, so what he said though was, that's the beauty of this model, and meaning the Food Policy Council, is that we operate under the radar of corporations like Monsanto and Cargill. Monsanto, Cargill, DuPont, whoever, they don't have their radar at the sort of level of municipal politics. This goes underneath them. And he said that's the beauty of it. And so, he said, I don't think that this type of model, or I guess we were more talking about how do we address these policy issues at a provincial level or at a federal level. And is it a matter of working at that municipal level and hoping that it filtrates up, or is there some other way, do you think, of addressing these issues at provincial levels when you're trying to deal with the way that corporations own our political systems?
You think I'm going to answer that question?
I don't know, I just think it's it's one of those questions, I think it's beautiful dealing with things at the municipal level, and is there a possibility that that sort of grassroots level of dealing with politics will actually eventually filter up to?
Well, okay, one of the issues that politically that we face is the centralization of everything. And at this point, in terms of Canadian governance, everything is centralized in the Prime Minister's office. And there's no access to that. John Baird has been our MP. I've never met anybody who's got anything good to say for him. But he's totally inaccessible. I don't have a representative. Yeah. So how do we deal at that level? What can we do? And if anybody speaks up in the bureaucracy, if they're an NGO or anybody, and then you go down the list, their funding is cut. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. If you're a civil servant, you'll either lose your job or you'll be ordered to shut up. And I mean, it's incredible what the situation. I don't think people realize how bad it is. But it's certainly, when I talk to neighbors who work with Health Canada or Ag Canada or somewhere, and you get these stories, and the kind of repressive regime that we have is a virtual dictatorship. And it comes down to, well, what's muzzling scientists? You can't talk about your work without going through head office and being censored. And we talk about democracy. So if that's the situation, I was involved with the seed regulatory review. And I finally realized, this is a total waste of my time. All they're doing is sucking up my energy and distracting me from doing something worthwhile, because they've said, actually, we're not going to listen to you. We listen to the corporate sector, to these players. We're not interested. We'll make it appear. We have all these consultations, and you'll be invited to consultations. That's just a sidetracking again. So I think, what's happening is what's interesting is not only all these local movements, but now they're beginning to knit together, and that's what Food Secure Canada is about, and what the People's Food Policy Project is about, is saying, okay, we're not going to waste our time addressing government, which has got its stoppers in its ears, unlike mine, which are supposed to be receivers. Stop, we haven't got that much energy to waste that much of it. We've got to work, and all those multiple local levels, I think, are where the power is and is going to be. And we devolve a lot of that that we've given over or has been taken over. So I don't know, is that an A?
Yeah, sort of. One thing I just thought of after was how in the U.S. there are all these state-level food policy councils that are popping up now, right? And they seem to have some effect. I know, the New York State Food Policy Council was able to bring together a whole bunch of small farmers to start supplying, institutions with organic carrots that were coming from family farms, those sorts of things. So you have these at the state level, and so they're actually getting away with these things and, getting away from the sort of corporate ownership at state level. And what is it? I just can't put my finger on what it is about Canadian politics that we can't do that at the provincial level here.
Well, I mean, remember one thing, the U.S. is 10 times the size, and the USDA can accommodate these nice little things over here and mollify this bunch of rabble-rousers and meanwhile carry on mainline stuff. That's no problem. I heard Vilsack speak a couple of years ago at wherever it was, for the Community Food Security Coalition. I loved what he had to say, but look at the policy. Look at what's going on at the same time. Yeah. It's I think it's really important not to have any illusions about where we are politically in this country at this point. I think we're in desperate shape, and people really got to understand it. But that's why I want to go behind that. How did we let that happen? And where do we take that back and say, all right, this is what we're going to do. If you have a problem, that's your problem, but this is what we have to do. And we're going to take over this land. I mean, when do we start taking over so-called public lands, or what should be, and gardening them and farming them? And have enough people willing to go out and when they try to move in and say, sorry, we're staying here. I look forward to that.
Guerrilla gardening.
I first heard of you back in the 80s, and I've lost track of a lot of your work since that time. Those were in the farm crisis days. What I'm curious, and you may have addressed it in other writings you've done, but have you formulated your notion of a consumer's bill of rights? And if so, what are the 3 or 4 primary tenets in it?
Don't get me onto the rights discussion. We'll be here for another 2 hours. Read my book,
Which one?
Tyranny of Rights,
Okay.
my last one.
So you wouldn't be an advocate then of a
No.
consumer's bill of rights? That's
No.
what you're saying. Okay.
No, I think the whole rights is part of the problem. All the rights discourse is part of the
By
problem.
consumer's bill of rights, I'm meaning such things as the ability to know where their food is grown, the
Yeah.
ability to know how it's...
But then that's what we should talk about, that any reasonable system would, the CFA should require labeling. Now, it's not a question of rights. It's a question of the responsibility of the regulator to do its job.
Yeah, maybe rights is the wrong word.
But I want to stay away from the rights language because that sets up this competitive, my demand sort of thing. It's the whole approach.
Okay, and my second question is, are you optimistic about the new media and the interconnectedness, the ability, the growth of the blogosphere, in terms of favoring the kind of reinvention that you're talking about?
Well, I have a problem. As you might have guessed, I don't want Facebook or anybody else to have whatever information they might think they should have about me, nor do I want my communications diminished to whatever it is on Twitter or whatever. I don't know how you have human communication reduced to some kind of code. I don't like the telephone even. I'd much rather go and talk to somebody so I can read the body language and understand who is this anyway? You know, it's like the email. I use the email, I have to, a whole lot, but I'll go out of my way to meet the person that I'm trying to communicate with. Well, I can't see them as disembodied something or other, and that's part of this, what I was trying to convey here. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a good question. Claire and I were talking about that over dinner, about what happens to your ability to think critically and holistically if everything is fragmented. That really worries me. I don't know what the answer is, but it worries me. I read something like New Scientist that used to have long, in-depth material, and now everything's gotten shorter and more popularized. And I'm not going to read it anymore. It's not worth it. Everything's been reduced to, bits and pieces. I'd rather read a good book.
Hi, my name's Jens Peterson, and followed some of your work here for a while. But anyways, no matter which field it is that we're working on, whether it's the environment, whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, whether it's agriculture, those of us on the progressive side keep running up against moneyed interests. And so what I want to caution all of us really against is just some of the language that we use, because again and again I hear terms like corporatocracy and corporatism, and corporations are bad. And you might make the mistake, because I'm dressed like this, that I'm going to defend corporations, and I'm not. But we ought not to be distracted and think that corporations are the problem, because they are not. The problem, well, let me just explain that first. Corporations, like you said, are nothing but a legal fiction.
Yeah.
They're just a rule, a legal rule that we have allowed to be created. And corporatism is really nothing more than feudalism. These are just legal rules that keep the rich rich and the poor poor.
Yeah.
The problem is inequality and the acceptance of inequality. And if we allow ourselves to point at corporations, we allow everybody to forget that the problem with those corporations is not that legal rule. The problem is that there are a bunch of extremely wealthy people who believe in inequality and are working very hard to continue and actually make that inequality worse. And it's that at which our efforts ought to be aimed, not at the corporation itself. And that's, when we get into talking about language and framing, of course, when we're talking to people who don't spend as much time as us thinking about these things, when Potash Corporation puts, donates $3 million to your local stadium, or whatever the cause is, or all of these things, they say, well, corporations can't be bad because look, they just did good. And that's why we ought not to be confused and devoting our energy to corporations, but actually on inequality and the people who believe that inequality should be continued and perpetuated.
I wouldn't argue with you. I mean, you're right. The corporations, that's why it's interesting. The corporations have changed over the course of the years from the original. And that's our responsibility. I mean, we've allowed that to happen, or we in a larger collective sense. And somehow think that's immutable. Well, it's not. Because it's going to take change of a whole lot of people to get it changed. But I would say, you're, in terms of singling out the corporation, I would say, you're right. But behind that, there's the other C word, which we're not supposed to speak, right? Capitalism, which is based on the accumulation of wealth. That's what it's all about. That's the golden rule of capitalism. So how do you accumulate wealth? Well, if you say that's the golden rule, then you're stuck. You've just put yourself in an impossible position of allowing that accumulation you're talking about. I was kind of intrigued to see how the potash deal would work out, because Bill Doyle stood to take home $400 million if the deal went through, cashing in his shares. How in the hell did we create a situation where some guy could take, whose money was that? It was the farmer's money. It was a whole lot of people's money. What's he doing? And how does someone like that live with himself? I don't know. So, that's why, you never know. Is someone going to get up and shoot you if you say capitalism? We're led to believe that in many situations. We don't discuss that. That's getting too close to the bone. So anyway, I'm here I am, if you want to get me. Claire.
Thanks for your talk, Brewster. A couple times you've mentioned your book tonight. You mentioned your book to us a couple times tonight, but when you mentioned it to the last person, you suggested that you didn't want to speak about it. But I'm just wondering if there is something that you wanted to share about your recent work on the gene. You want to share that with us?
This is a planted question. No, it wasn't. Well, I didn't want to get into self-promotion. Thank you, Claire. No, I just want to mention, because I've sort of, in going through all this stuff, that as Trevor said in his introduction, living with this stuff, because I went into farming with a kind of a critical economic background and development and economics and so on. So I kind of had a head start, and I've sort of kept always examining the structures and institutions and practices, and that's just the way, I don't know how I got that way, but I'm always asking questions. Well, why is this? Why didn't I know? Anyway, I said, I know enough. This food stuff is getting a bit boring. I know I've spent, I don't know how many years dealing with this stuff. I need to move on. My own brain needs fresh food. And it wasn't to put that down. It was just say, okay, somebody else, there's lots of other folks working on that now. I can move on. And it was partly the question of the right to food that was being talked about a lot, and food security. And my response to the idea of food security, I said, that's really, I don't want this military terminology applied to the food system. It's not about my security. That's this individualistic stuff. I want to have my food and you stay away, what that does. And then it was sort of the right to food. Well, that's to me, that's a strange notion. What do you mean, the right to food? We all need food. I'm not asking for a legal right to food or the state to give me food or anything of the sort. If you're a peasant farmer, a subsistence farmer somewhere, just stop sending your troops in to drive me into town, and take over my land for some corporation or some big peasant farmer or some big monoculture soybean grower. So I just got to thinking more about rights. And then when I started thinking about that, I began to see the word cropping up with increasing frequency. And I thought, what's going on here? And very often I'd look and see, okay, if you simply erase the word rights, oh, that's a better statement now. That makes more sense. It's got stronger. Why is this rights language? And I frankly think it's become kind of a invocation, a blessing on whatever somehow, or that it trumps everything else. Is what you just use the rights and that puts me in an untouchable category. I mean, that's a sacred term. And a wonderful book I just read called The Last Utopia on Rights. He says, well, someone dealing in rights, it's like talking to a church historian. You don't question their church history. It's a theology. And so you just buy this into this, and somehow that solves all your problems, when actually it solved nothing. And I say, and well, my book is just an exploration of the idea of rights, and right to water, right to land, intellectual property rights, right to intervene, right to die, right to life. Okay, wait, what is all this about? And I sort of look at the epitome of that and say, fetal rights, the right of an unborn infant asserted against its mother. But there's those who argue, and say, this is really weird. But that's where it's gotten us. So I said, right. So I've been trying to just take the whole thing apart and say, surely we can do better. And a lot of it, which I sort of hinted at, is saying, oh, no, I'm not going to ask you for the right to live or the right to eat. Just leave me alone and I'll grow my own food. And I'll feed my family and so on. I'm not going to ask permission for that. Or the right to do it, which means I've got to go call a lawyer to advocate on my behalf, and he's got to be paid well. Are there any lawyers here? I don't know. Okay. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Nobody's leaving yet. Well, okay. I'm not leaving either yet. I'm not leaving until 11 o'clock tomorrow.
Brewster, given your background in theology and economics, I haven't read The Ram's Horn since my days at the University of Guelph. I'm curious that you don't talk about a theology of the land, that you make reference to Mother Nature rather than creation. You don't talk about idolatry. You don't talk about mammonism. You leave all that stuff aside. Why?
Hey, well, that's a good challenge. I'm thinking I should write my theology. Maybe that's one of my next books. I don't know. Because I've wondered, I mean, where did it go? Sort of slipped away in the night. I do use the word creation because instead of nature. But I've been spending more time and being more influenced by Aboriginal peoples from all over the place. The Andes and BC and here and there in terms of language and thought patterns and cosmology and so on. And I find myself, there's some languages that I used to take for granted and use that I can't speak anymore because of the baggage that they carry around authority, external authority, sin, redemption. I mean, there's a lot of concepts. And the whole relation to nature and the alienation of that I see in certainly in Christian theology.
Christian theology doesn't use the word nature per se.
And it's right?
The word creation is a biblical word.
Yes.
Not nature.
Well, but it's our relationship that I find problematic. And you can deal with, you can go through a lot of apologetics, as they used to call it, to explain why this doesn't mean what it says, or it should mean this, or so on. But also maybe more fundamentally, and you sort of caught me off guard here, so I've got to. But the idea of the biblical history is presented in a highly linear fashion. And so you get this millennialism or utopianism, and I think there's a whole lot of confusion about that. And back in my graduate years, was heavily influenced by existentialism, saying, no, what matters is how we live now. And people, what about heaven? I couldn't care less. I have no idea what's going to happen, and I'm not really interested. I want to know, how am I going to live today and tomorrow, here and now? And I don't want this this preoccupation with something, and so on. I mean, it's not fair. You're asking an unfair question.
No, it is.
Because,
I think it's all tied together.
I know, but I mean, it is worthy of a great deal of discussion and thought, particularly in this culture. And I know I guess I've simply sort of tried to, I don't want to insult or upset people I've known for many years in many situations who are still comfortable with the languages I find I can't use anymore. And I try to figure out why. What's troubling? What's troublesome about it? And how can I articulate my problems to share them with other people? In a sense, it's just simply an invitation rather than a rejection or a judgment, because that's why I say, it's, and if I can't figure that one out, I don't want to talk about it, in a sense. And I find it's just, I guess that's about all I can say on the subject at the moment. We could sit down and have a long, more explicit discussion, but I don't want to generalize, because it's, again, in terms of things that people, beliefs and articulations that people have that are very meaningful and helpful and so on. I don't want to say, erase all that. Not for a minute. So it's a real problem. But I don't think it's just me. I mean, I suspect there's a whole lot of people who were raised to think a certain way and use a certain language and find that just gets increasingly uncomfortable. Otherwise, the churches wouldn't all be empty if we were still back there. And, so we have to struggle with that one. So. Thanks for the challenge. I mean, it's
Brewster, thank you very much. Toward the end of your talk, I began to sense a fear or a seriousness of the situation that we're in. Was I misunderstanding what you're saying? And if I wasn't, I have a fear about a growing police state, which even though those of us who spend dollars and vote for systems which are under the current radar of many, that doesn't mean that when they do get on the radar that the corporate governmental powers will not attend to them. And am I correct in saying that you sense some of this as well? I wonder what they're doing with the $1 billion or whatever of equipment from the G20 in Toronto. I mean, this movement around the world to accumulate forceful equipment, as they look ahead in the next 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 years to the world that they want to create, as opposed to the world that you and I want to create in food systems. Maybe I'm sort of split personality, because I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm not optimistic, but there's the theological distinction between hope and expectation, and my expectations are very low. My hope remains intact, and that's partly. No, Rebecca's gone. No, there you are. I've got my reading glasses on. In terms of scale of what we do, how is the hope expressed and at what level? But I guess I would say yes, I am fearful at what's happening within this country. Leave whatever else.
the path that the Harper regime is leading us down is a most unattractive and frightening one in terms of a police state. And that's what he would have. I mean, look at what do you do? The latest thing, which actually in the issue of the Ramshorn, which will go out this next week, will be posted on our website, ramshorn.ca. And I have in there, I've put together a bit of information on Haiti and what Canada's aid consists of. Building a prison, equipping the police, and training security forces. That's Canadian aid while Haitians die of cholera and starve and have no housing and so on. That's a pretty searing message to my mind. But that's very clear where this government is going. And the cutting of any critical voice gets its head chopped off or its feet or whatever.
Well, that's the police state I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's a police state. And look at the whole business around the G20. Totally unnecessary. But no, this is a security, a police state thing, and we'll practice here and there. So yeah, I think it's scary. And the fact that Parliament has allowed itself to be totally marginalized, which is, so now nobody wants to go into politics, because who wants to be part of that? And so you go around down the sewer. And I don't know. I guess we'll just have to keep agitating and keep our hopes alive and keep working away at it. And I think I frankly think it's going to take some direct action, some civil disobedience, and some refusal to go along with it at some point. You simply, no, I'm prepared to say, no, I'm not, sorry, not doing that, not going along with it.
Here is a phrase: a democracy depends upon the active participation of the citizens. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
I would certainly.
Yeah.
And I think more active democratic citizenship plus hanging together and voting with dollars for the systems like local agriculture, etc., which is in direct antithetical action toward the corporate governmental action.
And that's the value in the small projects. People say, yes, we can do something at this level. Well, then next level, then maybe up here, and then up here. I think that's where this. But all of that's what I mean about the individualism. That all means an understanding of oneself as a social being, not an isolated individual. And that's when you begin to overcome the fear. You're saying, well, yeah, here we are. It's not just me.
So you're saying a connectedness between us as opposed to a disconnectedness between us. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I have, two questions for me is really good. So it's a quick comment and a really quick question. The comment is, first of all, it's interesting. A lot of people I've talked to in the States say they can't use the term food security because if people hear food security, they start thinking police. So they think that food security means police, which, we know it doesn't, but anyway. And the quick question is, I always think about the significance of needing to change our world views, and I mean, what a huge sort of challenge that is. But I had a professor at McGill, Colin Scott, who's an anthropologist, and he does a lot of work with Northern Cree, like Cree communities in Northern Ontario. And he talks about language, the Eastern Cree language, and how in Eastern Cree, there's no word for nature. And sort of the significance of that. And I was wondering if that's sort of what you're getting at when you talk about individualism. That sort of idea that you can't see that there's no separation between everything, that sort of interconnectedness.
Yeah. So, is that a question?
I just wanted to check if that's what you were getting at with the idea of individualism, that we're so disconnected from everything, and you need to see that there's not a division between nature and people, and there's not a division between societies and governments and so on. I mean, it's that isolated dot is isolated from everything. I mean, so we then objectify. So you talk about, I mean, the latest thing that is highly problematic is when the president of Ecuador, who was the president of Ecuador? Maybe no, I can't remember for the moment.
Anyway, we had this conference 2 months ago in Cochabamba about calling for the rights to protect the rights of Mother Nature. And I thought that really is confounding. And whose language is that? Because that's not the language of Andean peoples, not remotely. That's the language of North American advisors. It's actually the language of the outfit in the U.S. that was advising on the new Ecuadorian Constitution and the language of rights. That's where it came from. So it goes back up, because I find the notion of the rights, we're going to call for the rights of Mother Nature. That's just turned the world upside down, I think, rather drastically. But that's the confusion that we're facing with. So
But isn't it we come up with things like rights because we're grasping for some kind of solution. Everybody wants to fix things, and it sounds like it'll appeal to the legal world, to the world of government, because you can assert these things as rights.
Yeah.
It's a straw.
I think that's why this book I was referring to is called The Last Utopia, saying there was sort of utopian thinking around communism, and that got subverted by the Soviet state. And it says now, and if you look chronologically, you see rights as the last utopia, the last hope for some kind of universal salvation. I mean, this is where I come back to the theological problem again. So it's trotted out, and it's quite interesting. It really, you question rights, and there are those who, particularly, as I've discovered, Germans who use the right to food language. You are blaspheming when you say the rights language isn't, when you question it. And you say, oh, this is a religious phenomenon. This has nothing to do with rationality or anything else. Which is why I wrote the book.
You have to specify and unpack what you mean by rights? I mean, sorry, if you can't hear me.
I can't, this room doesn't carry very well.
I'm just saying, I think you have to specify and unpack what you mean by rights. I mean, it's like any other term you can throw around, equality or justice or whatever.
Yeah.
Depending what you're talking about. And there's a multiple and often contradictory meanings to that terminology. Like just on the rights piece, I mean, the fact that indigenous peoples around the world have rallied around getting past, after many years of hard work, the International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it talks about not just individual rights, but collective rights of peoples for, survival and cultural flourishing. And like you were talking very eloquently about equality, and to my mind, I don't think we would achieve some of the things we've achieved in terms of equality and economic security and through mechanisms such as the welfare state. Imperfect though they are, it's a complicated question, but I think we're kind of throwing, the baby out with the bathwater a bit. I think we have to.
No, I can understand
what we're talking about.
I know what you're saying, but I will stick to my guns, as it were, because I think the question of the indigenous rights. I didn't mention this, but I mean, you get into a longer discussion about what I've written on. What I found intriguing as I got into it was sort of the discovery that the word for rights, doesn't exist virtually outside of European languages. Whether you go, my friend Marcelo, who's an Aymara, in Quechua and Aymara language, there's no word for rights. We talk about responsibilities to care for others, care for each other. And I find the same thing from people in Bangladesh, Korea, Japan, Turkey. Everywhere I start looking, I get the same response. That the word for rights is uniquely European. It appears now, like my friend in Japan said, well, yeah, there is a word for rights in Japanese now. It had to be cobble together in order to deal with this discussion that was being imposed on us, as it were. But it's not native. And an interesting...
If you take the notion of natural rights...
I can't, I'm sorry, I can't...
I'm sorry, if you take the notion of natural rights, as we've articulated it in Western philosophy, you may not find that exact word, but I think you find similar concepts in other cultures around the inherent dignity of human beings.
Oh, well, that's another, but no, that's, you just changed the language.
Well, okay.
To talk about dignity...
But I think the concept's the same.
No, because rights is a legal term. It's about property.
No, it depends, it depends on how you define it. You can
well,
talk about natural rights,
okay.
You can talk about social rights, you can talk about collective rights. It's not purely a legal concept.
No, but I mean in its application, that's the only place it has meaning.
Well, I don't see it that way.
That's a longer discussion.
Yeah, true enough.
And I would be glad to carry it on with you, but I would, please read my book, because I've worked this through.
But please think about what the multiple and often contradictory meanings of words too.
But I would, because having had the same response, people say no. In every case where they've come up with a word for rights, what we speak of in our own culture is a responsibility. It's the other way around.
Wow.
And rights are not just, it's not there. So it's a real challenge. And I've questioned whose language is particularly problematic, because I don't know of any indigenous language within Canada that has a word for rights.
Well, I guess I come back to the question,
So,
why was there this huge international mobilization around
well,
the Declaration of Independence?
I think we better table that one.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
So I think we've done it for tonight. Thanks for your questions and your attentiveness. I'm a little amazed what it's gotten to be. Holy smokes.
Brewster, I just want to thank you very, very much for your talk. Really great. And so can we move to the back if people want to book?